Getting higher on air-breathing engines. That's what this episode is about, as I work through the designing and flying of this high-altitude jet. Modeled after the U-2 reconnaissance plane, the mission is to complete the Stratospheric Research contract, which requires cruising at an altitude of above 22 kilometers. I also take a look at the upcoming satellite programs and significantly increase my research team to help unlock some much needed tech. Let's get started. Last episode saw the completion of the 5,000 kilometer downrange milestone, which finally finished off the early rocket development program. A program we didn't quite meet the deadline on, so the funding was pretty much dried up, but that's okay because what I'm going to be grabbing next is, and again, I could go for heavy satellites. I do have the slots available for that. But what I don't have is the confidence of that, given how the last one went. I'm hoping things will start going quicker now that I've got more engineers working for me. Finances are working well. And speaking of finances, look at the financing coming from this. We're going to grab this on the fast level, not normal, not breakneck, just fast. And we're going to grab that. And that's going to give us a ton of funding and going to give us a whole batch of new contracts. The first of which is downrange milestone 6,000 kilometers, very similar to the 3,000 and 5,000 that you've seen previously. 6,000 kilometers downrange, have to reach a minimum altitude of 140 kilometers, have 50 units of sounding payload, but basically that's it. But that's going to have to wait for a future episode because this episode's focus is going to be on a contract I picked up a few game months previously. And that is this guy, X-Plane Stratospheric Research. Reach an altitude of 22 kilometers. One crew aboard, no jets. Has to be a jet, no rockets allowed. And you have to have a speed below 300 meters per second, an altitude of over 22 kilometers, and maintain a level flight for 5 minutes. That's the idea. So I am looking at building a new plane to pull that one off. I have to start with the X1 cockpit, as it is the only cockpit I have that can go above 16 kilometers without risking harm to the pilot. This cockpit has received the X2 upgrade and so can actually reach 70 kilometers, though obviously this plane isn't going to go anywhere near that high. The engine I started off with was the J57 turbojet, but without the afterburner. I figured the plane wasn't going to need the extra thrust and I thought I could save some weight. This turned out to be a mistake, and I will eventually replace it with the version with the afterburner, the exact same engine as on the previously flown F-104, so if you are following along with the build, you should likely go to that version of the J57 engine now. What I'm using for inspiration is the U-2. This U-2, manufactured by Lockheed and first flown in August of 1955, and still flies to this day. The U-2 was purposely designed as a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft and, given the era, seemed the perfect place to get started. As with the previous F-104, I'm going to match the dimensions of the real-world craft as best I can, starting with the 19.2 meter length. Most of that length came from a procedural aluminum tank. At this point in my game, I had yet to unlock early material science giving me the aluminum stringer tanks. The tank was set to a hollow cone, 15.4 meters long and with an inner diameter 20 millimeters less than the outer. I currently have 3 radial intakes to choose from. The XF-104 shock cone intake, which is what's on the F-104, is for supersonic flight. The other 2 are for subsonic jets. But I chose the XMG-50 Pitic intake over the similar XMC-200 because it can take in more air. I figured I was going to need that in the higher atmosphere. Next came 2 radial tanks, which I ripped straight off the F-104 with no further adjustments, though I did remove the fuel tanks. I'm going to be storing the fuel elsewhere. The plane's wingspan was a monstrous 31 meters, by far my longest wings to date. These are also by far my thinnest wings. The original plane also had very thin wings, all in the name of keeping the weight down. The wings were shaped to look, as best I could, the same as on the original plane. All the fuel was stored in aluminum tanks attached to the wings. These tanks would eventually be 600 millimeters in diameter and 3.2 meters long, with an additional tank at each end set to smooth cone with the same diameter and 600 millimeters long. These also got filled with kerosene, with the utilization set to the full 87%. 4 control surfaces were attached to the wings. The ones closest to the fuselage is just structural, with all of its attitude controls disabled. Next came a set of flaps, followed by a pair of ailerons with the roll control set to 50%. And finally, another pair at the end that, like the innermost control surfaces, were just there for structure. I finished off the wings with one more wing part, tweaked really small. To the fuel tanks on the wings, I attached 2 LY-35 medium landing gear, making sure the snap was on, and then using the move tool to slide them further out on the wings. Don't forget that you can hold shift to move parts as far as you like. These gear are well ahead of the center of mass, so this plane will be a tail dragger with a single small landing gear towards the back. I started off the tail by taking the tail from the F-104, but then changed the shape of all the surfaces to look more like the rather large tail that was on the real-world U-2. I did add one additional single control surface with the actuation toggles off between the elevators to help clean this end up. After the completion of the rudder, I checked on the locations of the centers of mass and lift, finding the center of mass further back than I would like. As it stands right now, this plane would be unstable. Moving the lifting surfaces didn't fix the problem, and I don't want to get into further changing their shape, so I pulled the center of mass forward by adding a small aluminum ballast tank right behind the cockpit. I filled the tank with lead ballast, then made it only 200 millimeters long, adding the same length to the central fuselage so the overall length of the plane remained the same. It was then a simple matter of adjusting the utilization on the ballast tank to get the center of mass where I wanted. This is a very simple means of balancing the plane, and it doesn't add as much weight as some may think. I then took a quick look at the rather encouraging stability derivatives provided by Ferram Aerospace, and then sent this thing off on its first test flight. Now I'm hoping it's already pitched up a little bit. Might take off without too much encouragement. And those wings are huge. There it goes. There it goes. There she goes. Okay, and we will engage our cruise control. And we'll see what she can do. Now she ain't going to be fast. Before takeoff, I made sure to go into the craft settings on the autopilot and set the G moderation to just 2 Gs. I really don't think it will take much to rip these wings off. That's interesting. It's actually pitching down. It wants to go up at a higher rate of climb than this. So who am I to argue? And the wings are still on. The wings are, oh my god, look how big, oh my gosh. It's actually kind of glorious. I like it. Wait till I paint you up, and I want to fix this bit in here that doesn't look right there. After a turnaround to make sure the plane was structurally sound, I decided to try making the horizontal stabilizer a bit bigger to see if that would make the plane more balanced and provide a tad more lift. I then ran it out for another test where I realized that the steering on those forward landing gear most certainly needs to be disabled. The plane was definitely better balanced but clearly underpowered. Nevertheless, I decided to see if I could nurse it up to the 22-kilometer altitude required for the contract. This took a lot of time. I would fly horizontally for a bit to build speed, then pitch up slightly, losing speed, then fly horizontal a bit, and repeat. And at about the hour 20-minute mark of the mission, I was almost there when I got this message. Why does his head feel light? CO2 boy, he doesn't have a scrubber board? No, unfortunately that technology doesn't exist yet. Kevin has spent too much time being forced to breathe from the onboard oxygen supply, and the CO2 he's been exhaling has built up to a dangerous level. If I'm going to do this contract, I need to be able to get to altitude faster. Unfortunately, I went down a couple of blind alleys before doing the obvious. First, I tried putting an X1 cockpit on my F-104 and seeing if that could get to the required altitude. Although dorky looking, this isn't as crazy as it may appear, as the real-world F-104 was the first aircraft to simultaneously hold both the speed and altitude records, reaching over 27 kilometers in altitude in 1958. Unfortunately, my F-104 just couldn't do what was needed. I then went for the more obvious idea of putting a more powerful engine on the U-2. Unfortunately, I chose the J79 turbojet, completely forgetting the fact that the blue background means that this part is currently being researched. Armed with this yet-to-be-unlocked engine, the U-2 had no trouble at all getting to altitude in a comparatively short amount of time. I thought I had this and moved into the painting and decal phase of the build. I never realized I had a problem until I tried to integrate the vessel. Vessel warning: cannot be built. It contains parts... contains parts which are not available at the moment. One J79 turbojet. Oh no. Yeah, the light is slowly coming on. And this is where I finally went to the engine I finished off with, the J57 turbojet. Now, around this time I had posted to my Discord of Kevin's CO2 issues and that I needed to get to altitude more quickly, and one recommendation that came my way was to try air launching. I was surprised to find that this plane fit within the restrictions of my air launch system, so I figured I would give it a go. What I didn't anticipate was that air launching isn't a bad way to test the balance of planes. Yeah, look how I'm doing nothing and it wants to, so that means more ballast at the front. Just wants to pitch up. Again, rather than tweaking the lifting surfaces, I just increased the utilization on the ballast tank a bit. And after only 2 tries, I had a plane that I was pretty happy with. It flew great, no issues with getting to altitude. The landing, however... I did it. Slow down slowly, full flaps. Whoa, where are you going? Where are you going? Hey, what the was that at the end? The was that the steering on the rear landing gear needs to be inverted, though I hadn't clued in on that yet. Either way, this is the version of the plane that got tooled and integrated, but it was going to take a few months to build, and in the meantime, I had other stuff I had to do, which is pretty much what you saw last episode, bringing us to the present, where I was realizing I never did test this final version of the U-2 taking off from the runway, and, as we'll see, sometimes some distance can give you fresh eyes. So as I was saying, the advantage of taking off from the runway as opposed to an air launch is the turnaround is so much quicker. In case I get a second contract that needs me to go a little bit higher, this plane is still getting a whoa, that steering's the wrong way. Okay, let's get up. Okay, gotta fix the steering on that. Oh, because it's at the back. I gotta reverse the steering. Oh my gosh. Okay, that was pretty... Okay. Anyway, when I do this mission a little later in the video, you'll be finding out whether I ultimately decided on a runway takeoff or an air launch. Another good thing that came out of doing this one extra simulation is that it reminded me of how gentle I need to be with the brakes on this thing. Nice and gentle-like. Like, just like a bit. Oh wait, I forgot about that. Okay, let's so that was the brakes, and then the cockpit dipped down and boom. Okay, so you gotta be really careful with the brakes, gotta remember that. It was just a quick edit to invert the steering on the rear landing gear, and just for good measure, I also moved up the forward landing gear a bit too. You'll be seeing this plane fly the mission in just a little bit, but first I wanted to take a quick look at what tech nodes are currently being researched. Oh, they do have some goals for you here, don't they? I didn't even notice that. Oh my gosh, that tells me how far off I am. Yeah, it's currently March 10th, 1957. See, this is behind, and this is behind. Now I can see. I never noticed these dates before. That all aside, what I'm really looking for here is what to prioritize to get to orbit-capable rockets, as well as finishing off the X-plane program. Once out of the R&D center, I reordered my science research, and then, bolstered by the new funding stream coming from the early satellites program, I hired an additional 110 researchers to speed this process along. I've got some catching up to do. It was then time to start my pilot training for the inaugural launch of my U-2 high-altitude jet. As you can see, I did decide to take off from the runway rather than air launch. Reducing the turnaround and mission costs definitely makes this worth it. Just a quick reminder of the contract, this is X-plane Stratospheric Research. Not that there'll be any actual science collected on this mission. The goal here is to get to an altitude of over 22 kilometers, maintain a level flight at a speed below 300 meters per second for 5 minutes. I strongly suspect there will be follow-up contracts to this one requiring us to go higher still, so you'll likely be seeing the U-2 again. It would be lovely if it could be this exact plane, but don't forget that I've now unlocked early materials science and can still upgrade the fuselage to aluminum stringers, making this thing even lighter. Not to mention that the mature supersonic flight tech node is just around the corner as well. The mission plan is to fly due east, complete the requirements for the contract, and then turn around and come back to the KSC for a runway landing. I'll be keeping my speed in the ballpark of where it is now, adjusting my climb angle accordingly. If the speed begins dropping significantly, I'll just reduce the max climb angle on the autopilot and let the speed creep back up again. We shouldn't be seeing the same CO2 issues that we saw during testing. Right now we can see that Evelyn's oxygen is perpetual, but there will come an altitude at which you will have to go to the onboard oxygen supply. Okay, we're at 10 kilometers, so what I want to do is see when this stuff starts clicking in. I'm really curious what altitude that is. So, 10.5 kilometers, still working. Oh, there we go. See, so it's a little over 10.5 kilometers. Maybe that's where it is. Now she's using the oxygen that's provided on the plane. There's plenty of oxygen. She's got almost 2 hours worth of oxygen. But what you will see is that CO2 level beginning to creep up. Now it's nowhere near the danger levels, and it shouldn't, because I did do this in simulation. It shouldn't get up to danger levels, but it is something to be cognizant of. You cannot spend a whole ton of time up at this kind of altitude yet, because I got to find out where the scrubbers are on that tech tree and start looking at potentially. Probably you just get better capsules. That would be my guess, and then it's built into that capsule. And you can monitor her CO2 levels by just hovering over the little part here. You can see actually you can monitor a lot of stuff about how she's doing. Everything's at 0%. 0% is good. When they start creeping up, that's when you got to worry. Of all of the things that are here, what is the easiest thing to kill your Kerbal with is definitely the CO2 poisoning. I mean, that's exactly the problem that the Apollo 13 astronauts had to suffer with that the scrubbers weren't keeping up with removing the CO2. It is exceedingly dangerous. Good design on the humans. The gas that we expel from our lungs is actually poisonous to us, but you know, that's what we are. And if you're doing some sort of a mission with the X1 cockpit and you find that your pilot starts having CO2 issues, you will get warnings first saying things like your pilot is lightheaded and that. All you got to do is drop them below that, 10.5 kilometer mark and get some fresh air into the cabin and everything's fine. 22 kilometers, that is good. We are leveling off here a bit. We're going to put on our speed control. No reason to be going full throttle all this time. And we'll let that deal with that. I should have the thrust controller PID on. I do. And now we got to do this for 5 minutes. We've already done it for almost a minute. We've got about 4 minutes to go. I am time warping through all this. 8 seconds. 3 seconds. And boom. Okay, we have done that part. So now what we got to do is get ourselves back. So I'm going to get down to a cruising altitude of 10 kilometers so that we can refresh our capsule here. We can turn this to like, let's turn that to 10 degrees. We'll reduce our speed control to 150 meters per second. And we will turn around towards our waypoint. Again, I do have the G-forces being moderated to only 2 Gs. Although I did not do it in simulation, I would imagine it does not take much to snap off these wings. So I'm doing having it do a very cautious turn. We are a little less than 300 kilometers from the KSC, so should be getting ourselves back. And I'm not going to deploy flaps and all this kind of stuff. This thing is a pretty decent glider. And so I want to maximize the glide back home is really what I want to do. But I do want to get ourselves below the kilometers, get Evelyn off the oxygen, all that kind of stuff, even though I don't think she's in any kind of danger. Alright, so again, what was it, 10.5 kilometers? You'll suddenly see this CO2 level, there it goes, it's starting to drop down, 10.6 kilometers or something like that. She's again back on perpetual oxygen, she's able to breathe the air around her is really what that's saying. And her CO2's now normal. And I'm going to cruise at this altitude because I think this is a pretty efficient cruising altitude until this angle to runway gets a little higher, in around the 5-6%, I'm guessing. Yeah, we'll start slowing down. So we're coming up to about a 7.5 degree angle to the runway. So I think now would be a good time to begin our descent. So I'm going to change our altitude to 300 meters, like that. We're going to adjust our speed control down to 100. And we're going to deploy some flaps here to sort of keep this thing from, oh boy, full flaps, there we go. I don't want this thing to pick up a whole ton of speed.
I'm also not shy about using a quick save at this point before my altitude gets too low and the game won't let me do it anymore. Runway landings are always a bit tricky, and every once in a while the game's physics decides to have a hiccup, as it did on this occasion.
Look at that. Look at that. Now, I do have to be very careful with brakes. Whoa, what the? Okay, that was ridiculous. That was stupid.
This is a game I would never advise playing on hardcore mode. In a recent live stream in my Kerbal-sized Real Solar Systems series, kind of a mini RP-1 if you will, I built another tail dragger aircraft, and the suggestion was made in the chat to disable the steering on the rear landing gear as well, and only use the rudder for steering on the runway. That worked really well in the stream, and I may incorporate the same thing into the U2 here, but for now this landing will be as is.
What I got to get better at is really keeping an eye on that. I get so paranoid about running out of runway, but I really need to watch that vertical speed. Okay, full flaps. And watch that vertical speed. I'm a little high. Nice to come down a bit more. Full flaps. That can't be full flaps. Okay. And nice little touch. I gotta be careful with the brakes. Okay, brakes. We can steer a bit. Brakes. This really wants to nosedive. Okay, I think I'm good. A little bit of shakiness there at the end, but that all counts. And there we go. There is our contract, including the proper landing on the runway part of it for once.
The U2 will be ready to fly in about a week, but it remains to be seen whether there will be a contract available that it is capable of. Looking at the next part of the Stratospheric Research contract, it says I need 25 kilometers. Next episode, I'll have to check to see if that is within the U2's capabilities or not. And there's lots more going on too, including the first contracts in the early satellite program, as well as a new batch of more capable vehicles thanks to the recently unlocked aluminum stringer tanks and fairings. But all that is going to have to be for future episodes. In the meantime, I thank you for watching and hope to see you again next time.